All right, well, thank you all for standing by, and welcome to the Climate Tools Cafe webinar hosted by Ohio State University's Ohio Sea Grant, Michigan State University, Old Woman Creek, and the ODNR Division of Wildlife. This webinar is a grant initiative provided by the Great Lakes Regional Water Program and NOAA. I am Jill Gentis-Manicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today are four presenters from NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, NOAA's Coastal Services Center, and Michigan State University. We're delighted to have Drew Grunewald, Adam Bodie, Dave Esslinger, and Jeremiah Asher here today to talk about some climate change impacts, as well as several online planning tools NOAA and MSU have to help people prepare for climate change. Now, before I introduce the first speaker, a few logistical issues as we get started. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. After each presentation, Heather Elmer from Old Woman Creek NARE and I will conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during each presentation, please use the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, and just use the drop-down list of all panelists. And Heather and I will collect and pose your questions out to each presenter at the end of their presentation. Now, we have a great group of about 100 people here on this webinar, a great diverse group representing governmental agencies, academia, and nonprofit groups from the Great Lakes and around the country. Please keep those questions coming throughout the presentations, and we should have a great Q&A session. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto our websites for later viewing. We will have a few questions after each presentation in a poll that you'll see to your right, so please feel free to take part. If you are taking this webinar for Ohio Engineer or Surveyor Continuing Professional Development Credit, you will want to fill out those small polls for your credit. Also, we will post an overall webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the webinar. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill that survey out. It will help us continue to bring you better webinars. So without further delay, I would like to introduce Dr. Drew Grunewald. Dr. Grunewald is a hydrologist at NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, where he conducts research on watershed hydrology and water quality, focusing on measuring the uncertainty in environmental processes. Prior to joining NOAA, he worked as a scientist with the U.S. EPA and also as a professional licensed engineer in an environmental consulting industry. Dr. Grunewald will be giving us a primer on climate change impacts in the Great Lakes region. Now, Drew, I am going to unmute you. So you should be unmuted, and I am going to make you the panelist here. So you should be good to go.
Okay. Thanks, Jill. I'm going to bring up the presentation, and hopefully you can see it now.
It looks great.
Okay. So, Jill, thanks again, and thanks to everyone on the line for taking the time to call in this morning. Before I begin, I want to start off by pointing out that a comprehensive overview of the broad range of climate change impacts in the Great Lakes region is something that would require a lot more than 25 minutes to do a thorough overview of. And what I'm going to focus on today is providing you with sort of a satellite perspective on some of the key impacts of climate change on the Great Lakes region, in particular, how some of those relate to the management tools that you're going to be learning about later on in this webinar. So to begin with, I'm going to start off by talking about some of the drivers of Great Lakes regional climate. It's important to have an understanding of those and their variability when we think about managing responses to climate change. And then I want to highlight some of the impacts on some of the human and natural systems here in the Great Lakes. And then I want to dive into taking a look at some of the trends and projections in the major systems related to climate change, with a particular focus on the Great Lakes water balance, and then a quick example from impacts on Great Lakes ecosystems. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, there is really a broad range of information on this topic available at both academic institutions and federal agencies, and I want to steer you towards a few particularly comprehensive sort of clearinghouses for that additional information. So to start off with, if we take a look at drivers of regional climate, we sort of need to take a worldwide perspective on the Great Lakes. So here we are right here in this region of North America. And from a global perspective, we often like to think of four general drivers of Great Lakes regional climate. The first is the latitude of the Great Lakes. That is its location here within the northern hemisphere. The second is its location within the North American continent, particularly with how it relates to its proximity to the coastal seaboard here, and in particular the western seaboard here on the Pacific, with the predominant wind patterns coming from west to east. A third driving factor are global circulation patterns, particularly those related to patterns in the western Pacific. I'll talk about those again in a second. And then finally, one that we don't often think too much about, particularly in a global context, are the impacts of the lakes themselves on regional climate. They have a profound impact on both climate and local weather. One perfect example of this, of course, is lake effect weather and lake effect snow. So if we focus on one of these for a minute, I think it's important for this audience to have an understanding of when we talk about circulation patterns. One of the governing circulation patterns that you might hear a lot about is what's called ENSO, which stands for the El Niño Southern Oscillation. And quite generally, what this circulation pattern describes are changes in the sea surface temperature of the eastern tropical Pacific. So in this top panel here, what we're looking at is what we call El Niño, which in general reflects time periods where we have above average temperatures in the eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. And that leads to different location and trajectories of the jet streams over the North American continent, among a broad range of other impacts. In the bottom panel here, we have the other part of that oscillating pattern, which is the La Niña period, which is when temperatures in the tropical Pacific fall below average. So there's an oscillation between these two periods, but the take-home message is that this is one of those large-scale oscillation patterns that happens completely separate from the North American continent that have a profound impact on both local climate and local weather in the Great Lakes region. So let's shift next into some of the key impacts on both human and natural systems in the Great Lakes. And I want to underscore that there are a lot of documents that that summarize the range of impacts. I'm going to provide a highlight of some of the key ones, and with an emphasis on those that relate to some of the tools you're learning about later today. So one of the first impacts I want to focus on is transportation. Now, the Great Lakes are a hub of transportation in many ways, for the airline industry, for vehicle traffic, as well as for marine transportation. So this particular aerial slide, which shows a large freighter entering one of the locks on the St. Lawrence Seaway just west of Cornwall, underscores the fact that changes in climate that propagate into changes in water levels can have a profound impact on the ability of these vessels to navigate these narrow, shallow channels. So even though the Great Lakes are large and in general quite deep, restrictions on the depth of these locks and these channels can have a significant impact on the carrying capacity of the Great Lakes fleet. Another impact has to do with, quite generally, the impact on the coastal zone. Now, there are a wide range of impacts within that category, including changes in wetlands, wetland migration, changes in beaches, changes in erosion and infrastructure design capabilities. What I want to underscore here is a point that's often overlooked, which is that the Great Lakes coastline is massive. This particular image right here actually shows the length of the Great Lakes coastline relative to the marine coasts of the United States. And what we see here in red is the Great Lakes coastline outlined, at least on the U.S. side of the Great Lakes. We see that it has a length of roughly 4,530 miles. That's greater than either the Atlantic marine coast, the Gulf of Mexico marine coast, or the Pacific marine coast. And this is something important for us to remember when we talk about national coastal marine planning. It's important to understand just how great a magnitude we have here of coastline in the Great Lakes. Another impact, of course, is on the tourism and recreation industry. There's a document recently prepared entitled Great Lakes National Parks in Peril by the Rocky Mountain Climate Organization and the National Resources Defense Council. This document provides a really robust and in-depth review of how potential changes in climate can impact at least the U.S. national park system. But within there are a lot of indications of general impacts of climate change on the region. One that's highlighted in here are changes in snow depth, snow accumulation, and also ice area thickness and extent, not just on the Great Lakes, but also on some of the smaller lakes. This next slide I'm showing underscores one of the impacts that climate change appears to be having on ice areal extent. This is an image taken from a paper that was recently published by one of my colleagues here at GLERL, Jia Wang. His first name is Jia, and several other colleagues. And what it's showing is the aerial extent of ice on each of the Great Lakes. So on each of these y-axes here, for each of these panels, we have lake ice area in kilometers squared. On the right-hand axis, we have lake ice area represented as a fraction of the total lake surface. And then in this panel, we have Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario, going from roughly 1975 until about present. And for all of these lakes, we can see, in general, an overall decreasing trend in the amount of ice. Now, this has significant impacts not just on the recreation and tourism industry, particularly with an impact on snowmobiling, ice fishing, and some other activities. It also has a profound impact on the transportation industry. This particular slide underscores that fact. What we're looking at here is a slide generated by EPA back in 1990, but it is still particularly relevant to transportation patterns here in the Great Lakes. What we're looking at here is a slide where these circles represent the magnitude of shipping measured by tonnage in 1990, where the diameter of each one of these circles represents the total cargo volume in tons handled by that port in a particular year. So in this particular image, and this is still the case, the Duluth Superior Port handles the most cargo in total tons on the Great Lakes. Detroit used to be second, but it is actually no longer due to changes in industrial activity there. One of the take-home messages here is that this navigation to and from these ports is significantly affected by the extent of ice in the wintertime. And certainly as ice cover diminishes, and in fact if we have ice-free winters, it can have a profound impact on how much this region relies on and utilizes marine navigation for its economy. Another area I want to look at are the impacts on urban areas, and there are several potential impacts on urban areas that are highlighted in the literature. Many of them have to do with increased heat effects, but also the interaction between the urban areas and the lakes themselves. So what this particular slide shows is the distribution of the Great Lakes population. Individual yellow dots represent around 2,000 people. So these clusters of yellow dots you see represent major metropolitan areas, where we have here the Milwaukee and the Chicago area. We have the Detroit area here, going around to Toledo, Cleveland, and so on. The point here is that these urban areas and the ways in which they're impacted by climate change due to changes perhaps in increased precipitation, resulting in increases in combined sewer overflows and other impacts, can indirectly have a profound impact on the lakes themselves. Well, we'll be learning more about how to take a look at climate combined sewer overflow events later on in this webinar. And then finally, taking a look at impacts on agriculture. Throughout the literature, there are indications that changes in temperature and changes in precipitation might be leading to a longer growing season for many crops here in the Great Lakes. A slide that is often showed, or a set of data that is often also showed, has to do with yield of particular crops in the Great Lakes region. I recreated this particular plot from the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, which shows the yield of corn in bushels per acre in the state of Illinois going back to around the late 1860s or so up till present. Now, the most noticeable thing about this slide, of course, is that there has been a significant increase in yield starting around the 1940s, and much of that, of course, is due to changes in technology, but it's also due to changes in the growing season. One of the profound things I want to point out here is that despite these changes in technology and this increase in yield, climate and weather can still have a significant on crop production, taking a look, for example, at this particular year here, 1988, where there was a severe drought, which brought levels way down despite the technological changes that were going on at that time. So let's take a look now at some of the trends in major climate variables and how we arrive at some of the projections for those key variables. I want to start off by taking a look at the water balance of the Great Lakes, because that is, in fact, where a lot of these climate changes start, and regardless of what the impacts are, a lot of them are related to changes in the water balance. And let's take a look at this particular image of the Great Lakes water balance system, where we have here an outline of the Great Lakes Basin. And I want to draw your attention next to the set of arrows here in the center of the screen. What these arrows represent are the major components of the Great Lakes water budget. So on the far left here, for example, we have an arrow representing evaporation from the lake surface. These next two arrows represent evaporation of water from the land, as well as transpiration by plants. This next arrow pointing down is precipitation onto the land surface, which turns into runoff and propagates into the lakes. And then this last arrow here is precipitation falling onto the lakes themselves. Two key points about this slide I want to pass on. One is that the width of these arrows is roughly proportional to the magnitude of that component of the water budget. And there are very few water basins or drainage basins on the planet that have a lake evaporation, lake precipitation, and runoff that are on equal orders of magnitude. Second point is that over-lake evaporation and over-lake precipitation are very difficult to measure, yet they're critical components of the water budget. So this is some underlying context to any information that you see about the regional climate of the Great Lakes. One of the points is that it's a challenging story to figure out, and it's a challenging system to model appropriately, and that leads to a lot of sources of uncertainty and variability that underlie any of the information that federal agencies or academic institutions communicate about impacts of climate change on the region. Let's take a look at just one of these variables. Let's take a look at precipitation in the Great Lakes Basin. What I'm looking at here is a time series of precipitation observations within the Great Lakes region. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide. On this left-hand axis here and this right-hand axis here are actually used to describe water levels. And I'm not going to be showing water levels today on this particular slide, but this far-hand right-hand axis over here does in fact represent the magnitude of precipitation over each of the lake basins in millimeters. So for example, in this top part here, we're looking at a time series of precipitation. These are annual total precipitation values over the entire drainage basin just of Lake Superior. The same pattern is repeated for each of the other lakes, and the scale bar for those is over here on the right. So these green vertical bars represent annual precipitation values above the long-term average, and the orange bars represent values below the long-term average. What we see here are a couple interesting patterns. The first is that Lake Superior precipitation values, while they tend to be oscillating due to some sort of pattern here, they've actually seemed to have gone down in recent decades. And that reflects the fact that Lake Superior has a slightly different system than the lower lakes, in particular Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, where we've seen a pretty steady increase in precipitation amounts since the Dust Bowl year in the 1930s, and then finally significant increases in precipitation over the last several decades. Now, this is a look at total annual precipitation. What we're not seeing here are smaller scale changes in precipitation patterns, in particular the expected increase in the frequency of storm events and the magnitude of individual rain events as well. But I want to shift next to have a brief discussion of forecasts. And what I'm showing here I'm going to show a series of precipitation forecasts that come from a series of climate models that were published in one particular paper. This paper was a paper published by Philip Chow in 1999 in the Journal of American Water Resources Association. And I've extracted 4 different climate model runs from this particular paper to plot here to give an indication of the variability in projections of one particular climate variable. So these black dots, represent decadal average precipitation. That is the precipitation that's averaged over a couple decades, in black using the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory model. Next, I'll show in red the precipitation predictions from the Hadley Center model, and then the Max Planck Institute model, and finally the Canadian Climate Center model. So what we see here is that from one paper using just 4 different models, we have a range of predictions in future precipitation that almost span the range of variability in precipitation that's similar to the historical record. And I want to point this out because this has profound implications for how we go about making management decisions related to climate in the Great Lakes region. And this is a point that was underscored in the recently completed International Upper Great Lakes Study, a $15 million study that spanned over 5 years that just came to an end, that was sponsored by the International Joint Commission. The take-home message from that study was that the Great Lakes region needs to adopt an adaptive management framework where, while not ignoring the importance of climate projections for the region, we also need to never forget the historical record and continue to observe, monitor, and adapt to changes as they come. Let's take a look also at projections in water levels. And this particular slide has gained a lot of notoriety in the Great Lakes region. It's an image that came from a paper in the Journal of Great Lakes Research published by Catherine Hayhoe and others. It's showing the decadal average water levels for each of the Great Lakes systems relative to the average period for 1961 through 1990. And what it appears to show here is that we would expect Great Lake water levels to drop, in this particular case, by an average of roughly anywhere between 0.3 to 0.5 meters. A couple key features of this slide that aren't readily apparent here are first that these scenarios we're looking at are based on a high CO2 emission scenario in the future. And when you read the text of the paper, what you find is that under an existing CO2 emission scenario, we would expect very little change in Great Lakes water levels. A second point about this slide is that this particular paper and several others that were published like it at about the same time utilized a variety of different GCMs or climate models as forcings into a water balance model, but they all used pretty much the same water balance model. So while there was a perception of a broad range of variability in the modeling framework here, there was actually utilization of a single water balance model. And in that model, there was an assumption that temperature served as a suitable proxy for evapotranspiration from the land surface. And what some recent research has found, in particular research by my colleague Brent Lofgren here at GLERL, is that temperature may not be a suitable proxy for evapotranspiration in terms of estimating runoff from the Great Lakes basins. In fact, when we use temperature as a proxy for evapotranspiration, it may actually overestimate evapotranspirative loss and therefore underestimate runoff rates, which would lead to greater drops in lake levels than might be expected. There's a lot more research being done on that right now, but it's an important context for how there's a lot of background and a lot of story behind some of this images and the data that you're seeing about future trends in Great Lakes climate. One last final point here has to do with Great Lakes ecosystems, and there are a variety of trends and impacts we're seeing on Great Lakes ecosystems. Far too many to summarize this morning, but what I want to focus on has to do with changes in lake surface temperature. And what I'm showing here on the left-hand side are time series plots of seasonal changes in sea surface temperature across all of Lake Erie for the past several years. What stands out here is this black line, which represents the water measurements from this past spring here in 2012. And what you see is we had a significant jump in temperature. That's very anomalous compared to the historical record. And it might make it easier to see if we shift over, if I change the perception here. This blue line, these are very similar plots, but all I've done in this blue line here is averaged all of the temperatures for Lake Erie from 1992 through 2011 and contrasted those against what's been happening here so far in 2012. This warm temperature in springtime has a profound impact on a broad range of ecosystem factors, one of which it includes, but it's certainly not limited to, the aerial extent of pollutants and harmful algal blooms. Depicted here in this aerial image of the western basin of Lake Erie, one of the areas that's most prone to spring blooms and changes in sea surface temperature. So with that, what I want to do is finish off by just providing you with a few links to some additional information. There are 4 links I want to focus on. The first, as I mentioned earlier, are the results of the recently completed International Upper Great Lakes Study. This was a comprehensive study that was designed to understand potential impacts of different regulation plans for Lake Superior on the downstream lakes, their ecosystems, and the population. And you can find out more about that at this website, www.iugls.org. The second set of information comes from one of NOAA's regional integrated science and assessment centers. We're fortunate enough to have one of those RISAs here in the Great Lakes. It's called the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessment Center, or GLISA. They are a literal clearinghouse of regional climate information where you can go to find out more. NOAA has a climate services webpage which provides a good summary of not just regional but also global climate information. And then finally, from a United States bias perspective here, the United States Global Change Research Program provides a lot of good information as well. So with that, I'm finished with this portion of the talk and happy to turn things over back to Jill.
Okay, thanks, Drew. That was a great presentation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first, there's a poll for everyone, so I'm going to open up that poll for everyone to, if you could answer a couple of questions about Drew's presentation. Then I also wanted to start asking Drew a couple of questions that we have gotten. Any questions that you have for Drew that we can't get to, we'll try to do at the end of the presentation. Now, one question I had, and I'm sorry, I'm doing a couple of things at the same time, so I'm trying to go back to one of the questions. And I'm not sure if this goes out of your area of expertise, Drew, but one of the questions we had was in regards to the longer growing season. Other projections show wetter winters and springs and drought conditions during summer. How will that impact agriculture and annual yield? And if we have an extended drought, how will it impact demand on water?
Right. So I'm not familiar with a particular set of projections that question are coming from. Certainly, long periods of drought are going to affect yield. There's also been an indication about long periods of drought or changes in precipitation patterns relative to evaporation, leading to lower overall flow of water and increased water availability for irrigation. That could certainly have an impact on crop yield. Although more detailed information about impact on the agricultural industry are indeed somewhat outside of my area of expertise. So maybe after this we can provide a more formal link to some of the detailed information from USDA that can help answer that question a little better.
Okay, that sounds great. Another question we had gotten was you refer primarily to Lake Superior when discussing lake level fluctuations in the context of historical trends. But when you look at the smaller volume, i.e. more vulnerable lakes like Lake Erie and Ontario, which are also downstream and receive water from Superior, there appears to be evidence of significant deviation from historical trends. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. Let me see if I can, are you guys going along with the slides here?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a water level slide in this particular slide deck here. So, in general, the water levels are affected by a variety of factors. It is indeed true that the natural oscillations of the lakes tend to get, there's more variability in water levels the more we go downstream. So one way to phrase this is that Lake Ontario has actually the smallest surface area of all the lakes, but it's receiving the greatest sort of net flow of water. And as a result, these large changes in the volume of water coming through the system have a greater impact on the oscillation of the water levels on Lake Ontario itself. Now, one thing that would be nice to visualize and not to verbalize it here is that Lake Ontario began to be regulated in the 1960s in order to facilitate navigation through the St. Lawrence River. And that has also led to a change in the range of variability on Lake Ontario as well.
Okay. Actually, what I think we'll do, just so we can, because we have a couple more questions, but I think I might try to move on to Adam, just for the sake of time, and if possible, ask those questions that we have remaining at the end of the session if we have time. Is that okay, Drew?
That's fine.
Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is, Adam, I am going to unmute you, and I'm going to make you the presenter.
Okay.
And Adam, I am going to introduce you now. Adam Bodie is the GIS spatial analyst with the Baldwin Group and on contract with NOAA Coastal Services Center in Charleston, South Carolina. For the past 6 years, he has provided geospatial project support to the center's GIS integration and development program. He is currently serving as the technical lead for CanVis and provides technical support for the center's larger ocean planning efforts. Adam is going to provide us with an overview of the NOAA tool called CanVis. So Adam, you should be good to go.
All right, great. Thanks, Jill. Appreciate the introduction. Switching gears just a little bit from Drew's presentation here, switching more to a visualization tool that we've been using and supporting here at the Coastal Services Center for quite a while, and we call it CanVis. Just want to set the stage of going through some information about why you would create a visualization to begin with, some of the benefits of visualizations, some of the challenges and impact of creating such imagery, and then launching into some past projects, talking about the actual software itself, and then at the very end we'll wrap up with some links and information about how you can download the software and also utilize some of the support and resources that we have. So let's go ahead and jump right in. As long as there's no issues with audio, Joe, on your end.
No, you sound great.
Okay, great. So why create visualizations? A number of different reasons, anything from brainstorming an idea or developing a concept, using it to evaluate a design or management option. You can use it to illustrate ideas and alternatives, to present back to users and decision makers, and then overall just assessing the visual impact. So see here on the left-hand side, you have Lake Superior on the top image, shows basically the current state of this area, and then on the bottom, the simulation where this large hotel or real estate has been added to that area. So you can see this is something that's probably quickly done, maybe a matter of an hour, go out and find the image, and then utilize this software to kind of add in that hotel or that large piece of real estate. Just to generally use it to maybe further develop the idea and notice some of the visual impacts. So the benefits of visualization provides a window into the future. So you can combine some of the predictive capabilities of modeling in GIS with the intuitive and rich media of photography to create a realistic representation using local landmarks that really drives home and sort of strengthens that perspective and decision-making, allows you to present alternative futures and side-by-side, and pose what-if questions. So it gives you a presentation of choices for the future. As I said, you can pose a number of different what-if questions, and then it allows a lot of flexibility in the digital world. You can quickly change the visualization, maybe change a certain aspect of it, and then, like I said, pose those what-if questions back to the simulation to visualization. Really easy to engage stakeholders and the layperson. The attractiveness of virtual reality and its novel applications to conventional planning problems may be helpful in getting multiple stakeholders to engage in this public process or a public process. And then it allows you to localize an issue. One thing that we talk about in our actual training that we offer for this software is really finding those locations, those local landmarks that really drive home that issue of, somebody drives by or looks at this image and says, yeah, I drive by that on a daily basis. Well, that's really going to impact sort of my daily view. So next, can it really change behaviors? You might find it interesting that different types of visualizations or imagery elicit different behavioral changes. So, for instance, 3D visualization, such as the image on the top left here, it looks pretty, looks great, leads to a lot of cognitive responses, but it really doesn't lead to a ton of actual change. So, although it looks great and may be pretty when you have it in a presentation, it doesn't really elicit the sort of response that, say, a photorealistic visualization you may live in that apartment complex. As I said in the previous slides, maybe some place that you drive by or you know exactly where it is. You add a water surface on top of it that's going to show potential sea level rise, and it really drives home that sort of response, or that elicits that sort of feedback that you would normally get. So again, the impact of imagery. So there was a number of different, there was a study done, puts out a number of different issues that were presented to the resource management community, and it was found that there was actual increased dialogue when using simulations as opposed to using maps. And it spans, as you can see in the graph here, the number of different comments and references to the information. It spans and runs the gamut from elderly to adults to young adults. Simulations really drive home that issue. Now, what's interesting, and it sort of makes sense, is that when you combine the maps, the static maps, such on the bottom right, with a simulation on the bottom left, really elicits a more powerful sort of response when you combine both of those methods. So something that you want to keep in mind if you're considering using visualizations to sort of map and model potential climate issues. So as with anything, there's certain limitations. So cannot predict the future. So you take this example, for instance, it does a really great job of showing you what maybe a seawall would look like in front of this property, but it's not going to tell you anything about the potential environmental impacts or changes that are going to happen if you add that sort of hardened structure to this area. So it's great for making a pretty picture, sort of putting this back out there. Maybe you're a neighbor of this person and you want to see what it looks like, etc., but it can't tell you and assess the general environmental impacts. So now we're moving on to the software side of things. So in general, it's an entry-level program that allows resource managers to create photorealistic simulations with minimal computer skills, and that's sort of the key here. It's easy to learn, it's easy to use, it's fast to sort of get up to speed, utilize some of the training materials that we have out there, and of course, best of all, it's a free application that we provide support for. Originally, this was created by the USDA National Agroforestry Center to provide natural resource professionals a tool for creating simulations, and they were mainly using it in a more terrestrial context. The Coastal Services Center, since our constituents are more the coastal zone management community, we kind of took the software, we added some different objects, which I'll highlight in a few slides, and added more of the coastal component to it, and made it more valuable, more useful to a broader spectrum of users. So as with anything, there's a number of different software options out there. Just as the same if you were trying to weigh whether you produce a 3D visualization with software such as SketchUp or Maya or Visual Natural Studio, the same would be true when you're actually selecting your software itself. So you can see it runs the gamut from different factors such as cost and expertise required, the time required to actually produce the visualization, and the outputs and the actual use itself. And you can see, for CanVis, the level demonstrated sort of in this presentation and the past projects that are going to be shown in a little bit here, you can see that it really hits that sort of middle of the road, beginner, easy to get started. There's no cost, so obviously it takes the cake in that respect. And then it's great for brainstorming and evaluation, and given the maximum size that you can kind of output these visualizations at, really sort of helps you determine what you're going to use. So the real foundation of this entire program is your base image. You hate to throw out the garbage in, garbage out, that kind of analogy, but it's really true in this sort of sense when you're creating visualizations. As I said, sometimes the most time-consuming part of this whole process is going out and finding a nice high-resolution image of an area that actually makes sense to you, and you want to actually show some sort of a visual change. So the base image is kind of the foundation, what you open in the application right from the beginning, and what you can create different objects, which I'll talk about here in a minute. You can draw objects from it, you can add things to this image, and basically it's the whole sort of the game here. So real quick snapshot of the software. Obviously, it's a little antiquated, it's simple, and I think that's sort of the best thing about it. What I've learned about it is, you could have something such as Photoshop, where it has hundreds of different tools and dialog boxes and menus, and then you could have something like CanVis, which sort of packages all the visualization tools and components all into one sort of simple user interface. It's got, 10 drop-down menus, a handful of icons, a couple toolbars that you can add here and there. And then, as I said, a number of different, the real power here is that you open your base image in the middle here, and then you can add objects, You can draw objects from the image, and you can manipulate the photo in a number of different tools. So there's tools in there to draw shadows and reflections. You can warp and transform different objects that you can add to the image. You can adjust the lighting. You can create water surfaces and other different areas where you can lay brick or pavers. And then we'll see some of this in some of the past projects and examples that I'll dive into in a minute. So to show you the general workflow, and again, I'll reference the training that we offer on an every month or every other month basis, really gets in more in depth. So this is kind of just going to be a broad overview. So you have your original object image or your photograph that, this may be a seawall or some hardened structure, but you may want to see what it looks like or use it in another image. So what you can do with the software is, you fire up CanVis, you open up this image, you kind of generally highlight the area using the tools in the application, and then you create what you call an object. And this can be saved out and then used, in this example it's showing is you save it out, and then you can use it in another different photo in the future. So you open another background image, say maybe this is a space where you'd like to see, you're considering a more hardened structure, or maybe you want to address some erosion issues in this space. So you can then add that extracted object directly to the image. Use some of the tools to sort of clean it up and blend and smudge some things, and really quickly and easily, kind of have a quick simulation that you can take to a project meeting, you can put into a presentation, you can use for a number of different purposes. So that's the general workflow. You have your base image, you can either add objects or extract objects from it, and then you sort of have your tool set to work and manipulate those objects to make it visually appealing. And it really depends on, what your purpose is for the end visualization. Whether this is going to be something that's going to be, printed in a book, you may want to have it be real high resolution, you're going to spend a lot of time on it, to a sort of quick and dirty visualization that, you just have a general idea that you maybe want to take to a group of 10 people and just show an idea. You may not have to spend quite the time and energy to actually create something that high resolution. So that's the general overview of the software itself. As I said, it's real simple, and without getting into a demo of it itself, kind of difficult to show you how the different tools and tool sets within it can be used. So what I want to do is show some past projects and visualizations that were created using CanVis, and maybe that'll give you a better idea of some of the potential uses that you can use it for yourself. So focusing on the Great Lakes for this example, obviously, as we heard from Drew's presentation, a lot of issues with declining water levels, the possibility for increased vulnerability to invasive species such as Phragmites, and then overall the impacts on public access. So as water levels decrease, some anticipate 6 feet in some areas over the next 30 to 60 years. There's going to be more shallow, low-lying water level for these. There's going to be new exposed bottomlands that will prove as fertile grounds for colonization of invasive species such as Phragmites here. So what what they wanted to do in this example is take this area and use a nautical chart. So basically you can say, all right, if water level is going to decrease in this photo by 6 feet, we'll reference the NOAA nautical chart and find that sort of 6-foot depth contour. And then we'll use the CanVis software to take maybe an image of Phragmites at an aerial scale, and we can quickly outline the area basically defined by this nautical chart. And we can quickly add that sort of Phragmites area to it to show, wow, this is really going to have a huge impact on this sort of space if declining water levels increase or happen as planned or as discussed. So you can see, you presented this in a presentation or some meeting, it has a very visual impact on your general thoughts for this area. So similarly, this is more of a head-on look. Once again, you can maybe have an image that you found, something on file that has Phragmites in it. You can extract that area out and then add it back to this photo to create, again, another visual comparison between, the current state and then given, decreasing water levels, what this would look like with Phragmites added into this sort of landscape. So that's just one example. So another example, staying in the marine space, the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So East Carolina University's Renaissance Computing Institute Engagement Center was using the CanVis software to visualize possible wind farm impacts on beach recreation demand in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So, as it says, really just wanted to see the visual impact of wind turbines at varying distances from the shore. They had a visual preference survey that they these differing scales or these differing distances from the shore, what sort of impact on the visitor? Are they still going to be willing to pay to come to the Outer Banks? Are they going to be willing to pay to come to these beaches if these wind farms are located at different distances offshore? So here's the village of Rodin, North Carolina, the Outer Banks, the current state of the beach. And then we used CanVis, or they used CanVis to add wind turbines at 1 kilometer offshore and then 3 kilometers offshore. So you can see again, real quickly, for this sort of visual impact survey, they created something pretty quick. They actually went out and took this photo. They took some measurements on the shoreline to get some distance heights. And then they used a number of different formulas to scale these wind farms down. And there's a number of different tools within the CanVis software itself that helps, sort of reference and measure distances and the heights of different objects. So sticking close to home, here in Charleston, South Carolina, focused on sea level rise and extreme weather events, shallow coastal flooding, spring tides, and then sea level rise. So we used the CanVis software, area near and dear to us here in Charleston Battery. This is just the sort of base image that somebody had gone out and taken a photo of. You were able to get some distances and some measurements off of some of the objects in the photo, and then we're able to add that, 1.5 meters of sea level rise to this area, so you can pan back and forth and see, sort of the visual impact that, sort of a quick simulation would have. So, again, the comparison. Switching to the U.S. Customs House down the road from the battery, that same idea. You can add water surface. This is something that was quickly and easily done. There's a number of different tools that you can, add reflections as you see them, different water surfaces, and sort of blend the photo back and forth to create your visualization. And just some other examples to talk about and depict some of the uses. So you were focused more on coastal erosion and different living and hardened structures and the various alternatives to, say, hardened structures versus a living structure. So this just shows a general area, and then the alternative of adding sort of a more natural structure as opposed to a hardened structure. So again, comparison back and forth. You can also use the tool in a different area back here in Charleston to show the various different type of structures that could be used to sort of harden this area and sort of evade erosion if possible. Next example, a terrestrial example. So the Fairfield Theater property received a streetscape grant. They had a CAD drawing. It was real complex, but it was real difficult to sort of get an idea of how this grant, where they were going to add pavers and sidewalks and a rain garden and some other different structures, was going to have a visual impact to the actual area. It's hard to go back to the town and the public with a CAD drawing shown to them, and they're going to generally see it and get a lot of head nods. So what they did was they used the CanVis software. They had this nice aerial image of the area itself that they were looking to add this streetscape to. As I said, they had their CAD drawing, so this sort of reflects and matches back up with this area here. And then they used CanVis software to basically take the CAD drawing. It defines what sort of street pavers or grass or parking spaces and trees were going to be used in this space. And they used that CAD drawing and CanVis in conjunction to create this sort of simulation. That was real helpful when they presented it back to the public. So you can see on the left-hand side, the sort of current state, and then on the right-hand side, the CanVis visualization that was created using the CAD drawing. Quickly go through another example in North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Similar idea, Main Street Streetscape Enhancement Project. And this was specifically used for presentation back to City Council. So they received this grant, or this project was thought about, and they basically went out and took photos. So this is one of the first photos that were taken just driving down North Myrtle Beach. And then the different examples of, say, just planting a couple of maple trees along the right-hand side, maybe what these will look like 20 to 30 years, the addition of some benches and some potted plants. So generally just presenting a number of different options back to the City Council itself. And lastly, we'll wrap up with an example from Seattle, Washington. So there was some legislation a number of years back that talked about extending shallow water docks to a certain length, adjusting waterfront seawalls, and overall just building heights itself. So they used CanVis. Similarly, they had a nice aerial image of an area, and this was going to be the large impact of extending these shallow water docks. So you can see they took mentioned, the Coastal Services Center kind of took what the USDA had originally created, added more of the coastal component to it. As I mentioned, objects over and over and over again. That's the sort of heart and soul of the software and what you create and what you can add to the image. So what we've done is we've provided a number of different packages and zip files containing docks and buoys and structures and different plants and all sorts of different people and things like that you can take. Really, you go to our website, you download the software, you can download these object libraries, and then use some of the training videos that we have on there. As it says, there's 40 training videos that highlights different various tools and functions. You basically click on one of the icons, pops up a short video, and then you can move on to the next one from there. A number of different additional resources available. The CanVis support itself, as I said, technical assistance. We actually have technical assistance office hours here at the Coastal Services Center every Monday afternoon from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. You can visit the Digital Coast website. Basically, some of the tool developers, myself included, and the folks that are sort of the experts with these tools, we're available from this time at any time, but that's kind of our time set aside to be really willing and ready to answer your questions. As I mentioned, we have virtual workshops, a newsletter, able to download the software, a number of different guidance documents on the website, and then the Coastal Object Library. The last thing I'll mention before I wrap up here is, this is kind of a real quick overview of the software, some past projects of how you can use it, some of the benefits and limitations of visualizations, but it's kind of a real quick overview of what it can actually do and how you would actually use the software itself. So every other month, apologize, it should be changed, the logistics here. Every other month, every third Wednesday, we offer a 2 to 3 hour training, CanVis virtual workshop, where we go over a little bit more in depth about visualization basics. I actually go through some hands-on examples, talk more about your individual potential applications, and really leave with a better idea of, take the software and use it for your specific purpose. So again, I encourage you to visit the Digital Coast website, check out the CanVis tools page, download the software, and contact us if you have any questions. So with that, I'll transfer back over to you, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Adam. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the poll for a couple questions about Adam's presentation, so I'll do that. And Heather is going to lead this Q&A session. So Heather, you're unmuted.
Great, thanks, Jill. And thanks, Adam, for such a great presentation. Before I begin posing some of the group's questions, I wanted to remind everyone that there is a poll on your screen to your right there, and it has a few questions in it about CanVis. Please take a few minutes to answer that poll, especially if you are an engineer or surveyor taking the webinar for continuing education credit. So questions for Adam. One of the first questions that came in was in regards to whether or not there are plans to add any models, such as erosion or sediment models, to the program to allow for some predictability of potential actions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, there aren't any current plans to integrate any of those sort of models directly into the software. They can certainly be used in conjunction with it, but I'm not sure. I'd be interested in following up with whoever asked that question, because we're always interested in potentially expanding the software to include additional functionality in the future.
Great. And another question come in. Will CanVis help users properly scale offshore buildings and equipment for the simulated photos, or are those things that would have to be calculated outside of the system?
Yeah, as I mentioned, that's a great question. There's actually a document specifically on the web page about scaling and measuring distances and how some of the different formulas and sort of things, how you can calculate, say, a wind turbine at X distance versus Y distance versus Z distance from the shore. And there's actually some tools within the software itself. As I mentioned, it would have been better if I could have done a quick demo of it to show you how you could use it. But there are actually some scale bars and some things that you can sort of drag into your image that give you a sort of base measurement, that allows you to help scale certain objects within the photo. So no, there's nothing in there where you can actually say, the wind turbine I know is, you went out and you took a photo and you measured it like a surveyor does, and it was X, Y, Z height. You plug it in and say, I want to see what it looks like, or what sort of it should be at a given height. There's no calculation tools built in directly, but there are a number of different sort of measurement objects that you can add to the photo that allow you to quickly and easily scale different objects.
Great. One more question. This is a little bit more specific in regard to follow-up and some of the technical assistance you might be able to provide. There's one of the participants has 19 communities involved in development of climate adaptation plans, and they're wondering if it's possible to tailor a presentation to some of those communities, and if so, who should she contact?
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Actually, you can just contact me. My email address is right here on the last slide, and I'd be happy to set something up specifically for that group. Sounds like a great opportunity.
Great. And finally, I have a question. If you could just say a little bit more about NOAA's Digital Coast. You mentioned that a few times in your presentation. If you could just say a little bit more about the Digital Coast and what other types of tools and resources are available and how people can get to the Digital Coast.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, just get to the Digital Coast itself, www.csc.noaa.gov/Digital Coast. Probably could take an hour and a half describing all that's contained within the Digital Coast website, but it's really sort of the delivery mechanism for all the different products and services from the Coastal Services Center, but also with the partner groups and agencies that are partners with the Digital Coast itself. And when you go to the Digital Coast website itself, it has basically divided up into big data. So there's ways where you can go through and you can sort data sets based on rate planning, a number of different issues, a number of different filters. And similarly, you can go to the tools section. CanVis is one of these tools. There's a number of different mapping applications, real specific tools. One of the tools that a colleague of mine, Dave Esslinger, is going to present on, it's available there. And then there's a training section, an inaction section that highlights how some of these tools have been used. So really it's a massive project and website and effort to sort of quickly and easily deliver these resources to the coastal zone management community and others for not only the coastal services projects and products, but also for partner groups as well. So I don't know if that specifically answers the question, but basically if you go to the Digital Coast website, a number of different ways you can access the data tools and training and different products and publications that are provided by the Coastal Services Center and related groups.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I think there's so much there. I just wanted to make sure everyone's aware that there's so much available on the Digital Coast. And finally, I think we have just a couple minutes left here. There's one more question on how or whether CanVis handles uncertainty in climate change prediction.
It does not handle uncertainty in climate change predictions. I'm not really sure the best way it could handle that sort of uncertainty. I mean, I guess what you would do is you'd create your visualization, and you could use it to show the different uncertainty or give a different uncertainty what the change would be. But probably what you would want to do is just make sure you preface that information during the presentation or when you actually are showing the visualization. But no, there's nothing within the software itself. Again, it's fairly simple. A lot of different tools focused actually on creating the simulation or the visualization itself.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I think that we did get to all of the questions, but we'll go back and check through, and if there are a few more, we'll try to address those at the end. But I think it's now time to move on to our next presenter. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jill so she can go ahead and introduce Dave.
Thanks, Heather. Dave, I'm going to now introduce you, and I'm going to make you a presenter. Dr. Dave Esslinger is an oceanographer with the NOAA Coastal Services Center in Charleston, South Carolina. His professional interests are in satellite remote sensing and numerical modeling and making technical information more accessible and usable by coastal managers. These efforts include leading the development and training of GIS tools for examining impacts of land use change on water quality and erosion, helping NOAA get more climate information accessible, and working on the historical hurricane track tool. Dr. Esslinger is going to introduce us to NOAA's N-SPECT. So, Dave, I'm going to make you now a presenter, so you should just about be ready, and you can you're already set.
All right. Thanks, Jill, and hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for tuning in. Again, as Jill says, I'm going to talk to you about N-SPECT, the non-point source pollution and erosion comparison tool. That is another tool that's available on the Digital Coast. And specifically, I'm going to talk some about our newest version of it, or show you some of that. That's an open source version. And N-SPECT is a water quality screening tool. And what that really means is it's a model that will produce an awful lot of numbers, and it looks really precise, but only believe the first few of those as if they're significant digits. So it's really meant to help you identify areas that you need to pay more attention to, not give extremely precise numbers like you might need for a TMDL. And it's a spatially distributed model to look at pollutant and sediment yields, and really to look at the impacts and compare the effects of different land cover and land use scenarios on those yields. And it's done in a user-friendly GIS environment, although sometimes people take issue with calling a GIS environment user-friendly. We think it works pretty good. What N-SPECT has in it is basically water runs downhill. So topography determines the slope and the flow direction. Then we use that flow with the soil characteristics, land cover, and amount of precipitation to develop an estimate for runoff. And then from that runoff and the land cover and some pollutant coefficients, you can calculate pollutant loads. And then we also implement some erosion models so that you can get sediment load. One of the things that we wanted to make sure we did when we developed this tool was not to invent our own, a bunch of new models, but rather take pretty widely accepted models and make them available in a GIS environment. And so to do runoff, we use the Soil Conservation Services pretty standard curve number technique. Non-point pollution is always a challenge. That's why it's such a hard problem. And we use an event mean concentration approach that I'll talk with you a little bit more in the future. And then in the for sediment erosion, we are using the universal soil loss equation. And because we did this in an area where they really wanted to know both about annual runoff and event runoff, we have two different versions of that, the modified universal soil loss equation, or MUSSEL, and a revised version, Russell. And mostly we're going to talk here about just doing things on an annual time scale and using Russell. I personally think that's a little better use of the tool. In any model, it's really important to understand what the assumptions are that go into it and what's left out of it so that you can use it to answer appropriate questions. And for N-SPECT specifically, what's not in that model are any sort of man-made manipulations of the environment by default, that water's just flowing downhill. So if there's a stormwater drainage system installed, you're not going to simulate that. Same with stream diversions. There's also nothing in it for snowmelt, and if you're looking for sediment movements on a large mass scale in the sense of landslides and such, N-SPECT is not the tool for you. Also, as kind of an oceanographer, someone with that background who really cares about things like nutrient dynamics and stuff, there's no time component in this. And that's probably one of the biggest assumptions. What that means is that the rainfall it's assumed to just come down and run off. So there's no first flush to get the high pollutants off and a time course of pollutant load coming off. It just uses this event average pollutant. So there's no runoff dynamics, there's no redeposition of sediment once it leaves the cell of its origin, and there's no downstream uptake of nutrients, for instance, to reduce the nitrogen load in the water or something. So keep those in mind. What N-SPECT does instead is it gives you an easy way to compare different land uses under a consistent set of assumptions and see what the impacts of those land uses would be. And so it's useful for some things, and we'll see some examples, but what some of our other there is one of the nice examples in looking at this over kind of a long term was here in South Carolina up near Conway. They were worried about development impacts on water quality in one of the local lakes and looked at different build-out scenarios that they had and examined the impact of those and kind of estimated when they would start to exceed the state water quality standards, so that they'd have to start paying attention to them. And so this is there's a study on this that you can get on the N-SPECT portion of the digital coast under the inactions. That's 2 words there, in space action. All right. Well, what does it take to run N-SPECT? We'll cover these in a little more detail. You need to have land cover. You need to have some topography information, an estimate of your precipitation, your soils, what's in there, the pollutant coefficients, and an estimate of erosivity. And those are all available from a number of places, but they're all kind of nationally available, so it shouldn't be too hard to get the data that you need. If you want to compare what you're getting with like your local water quality standard, you should know what those are. And if you want to add any pollutants of interest that might be of use locally, then you'll need some pollutant coefficients for those as well. And for any of these, if you have better local information that you've derived, then using that will let you get a little more accurate answers than using some of the more nationally derived numbers. But I'd encourage you, you're really doing comparisons by holding most things consistent. And so even using those, what some people think might be more average numbers for the U.S., those will work out okay lots of times we've found. All right, so just to go through what these data needs are, because this tends to be the hard part for people. The topography does define the flow direction, the stream network that's going to be used. We generally encourage people to use the 30-meter resolution data from the USGS. You can use finer resolution information, but this is a model that's running in a GIS system, and the resolution it runs per cell. So the resolution really impacts the processing speed and the file size. And because the land cover data that we have, let me show you, is typically at 30-meter resolution. And you don't gain a lot by going to a higher resolution DEM or elevation data set if the land cover is at 30 meters. It'll make the streams wiggle a little bit more, but they don't generally end up going anyplace different, and they have the same amount of nutrients in it. So the land cover really is this foundation layer. It's going to determine the runoff quantity, the sediment yield, and the pollutant yield. We serve the model up and have pollutant coefficients in there for the Coastal Change Analysis Program data. That's another product that the Coastal Services Center puts out. But it's very flexible, and you can substitute any land cover grid, although you'll have to kind of do a mapping of pollutant coefficients to that grid. And we'll show those in just a bit. For soils, there's only a couple of actual measures that we need. We usually recommend people get the Sergo soils. That's an excellent data set, county level, a lot of information in there, and you really want out of there the hydrologic soil group and an erodibility factor, that's the K factor. So those are pretty readily obtained from the soils data mart. And for every, and then you'll also need the SES curve numbers there. For every combination of land cover, we have the cover factors and curve numbers for runoff. I think that slide is actually pop up on the wrong page. Anyway, and the other thing, of course, is rain or didn't orient you. We are on Oahu, and we are on the leeward side in the Waianae area. And this is typically a very arid area, but you can, well, maybe you can see here the annual precipitation is up to almost 160 inches of rain, but they get that in about 7 rain events throughout the year. So it's very dry, and then they get some incredible rainstorms. And that's also up in the mountains, so it's very steep. And so here they had a very spatially variable rainfall pattern. When we do this for coastal South Carolina here, where we are in Charleston, we could use one number for Charleston County, in fact, for several of the counties around here, and that would be a very good estimate. So you only need this number as good as you, you only need to pay as much attention to this as you really care about how spatially diverse the number is. In this case, we had some point estimates from various locations at elevation from the state climatologist, and just did a simple regression of elevation versus rainfall, and it works out pretty well, and derive precipitation that way. So don't be afraid to come up with your own methods. And then the other thing I'd really encourage you to do is check out the Oregon State University, a different OSU, PRISM data there. And pollutants. So that's what we're trying to get to here. The pollutant coefficients, I call the magic numbers here, and the program uses this idea of an event mean concentration, meaning that it's the average pollutant concentration of a rainfall event, but it's then averaged over all of those that you might get throughout a year. So you can think of it as kind of the typical value that you would get over a year. So it's ignoring things like, it's not ignoring, it's averaging across all of those things, like if it's been 2 weeks versus your last rainfall event versus 2 months. If it's been 2 months, in reality, you'd expect higher pollutant loads coming off in non-point source pollutants, because there's been more time for stuff to accumulate. So those are all averaged out. That's why I think it works pretty well at the annual level. These are user definable, and so what you have to do, you can put in whatever pollutants are of interest. We do ship it with some kind of default coefficients, and what's needed is for every land cover class an estimate of the concentration of pollutant that will be in the water, and that's an important point. This is the concentration. So the runoff is determined kind of by the physics, the flow, but this one coefficient here, the reason I call it the magic number, it determines the concentration of the pollutants in that water. And you can see a lot of them, they're the same between estimates or between land covers. All right. Oh, that's interesting. Mine's looking a little odd. But let's look through some of the outputs that you get here. The first one that's important, and we'll talk mostly about here, is just the runoff. So you really get the volume of water, where it's going, so your total load. We've tested that over some of the little smaller watersheds up in Hawaii. It seems to work pretty well, even though it's a very simple model. And then, again, for erosion, you get the annual sediment load that's delivered to the coast. So this is in terms of kilograms. I'm sorry, these numbers are pretty hard to read at this scale. And remember, this is the worst case scenario. There hasn't been any redeposition. Similarly with nitrogen, you get the total annual pollutant load delivered to the coast or to your receiving waters. And then the other thing that you really get, which is different than some other models out there that might be similar, is you also see what the source areas are. And because this is a spatially resolved model, you can tell what your kind of which problem areas might be. So you see both where the pollutant ends up and where it's coming from. So let's go through again, looking up the Makaha Valley that we were looking at, and you can see how steep the topography is. That's a real image. It's not stretched or anything. What we're going to look at is on the annual time scale, if we put a little subdivision out in here. And we'll also look at very briefly at a climate change scenario. And we're now looking down. That other picture was taken up. Oh, you can't see my pointer right here. Let's see. It was taken from about here, looking up this way. And that big condo you saw was this, actually that dot. And so there's an undeveloped area here. We're going to develop and make it low-intensity development. There's a little suburb right here. We're going to build another one just across the road here. And what N-SPECT allows you to do is to, as a simple graphical user interface, and you load in a shapefile that says, here's my developed area. We've run it once to get our baseline conditions. And then in this, we use the GUI and just say, okay, I'm going to have a development, and I want to make it low impact or low intensity development, run it again, and get a new results. And I don't know if you can see how the colors in that area are changing just slightly. And then, because it is it's a quantitative change, or it's possible to quantitatively determine that because it's in this GIS system, and find out that that's a 138% increase in the nitrogen load coming from changing that land cover within that small polygon. But that's an example of the kinds of uses that this can be used for, really for looking at and comparing the impacts of land use change. But what about climate change scenarios? As Drew kind of mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in climate change. And what I've done here is just taken the same run that we just saw, but the default conditions here were to have 7 raining days of a type 1 rain. And for those who don't know that, that means the rainfall falls, you get about half the rain in a fairly short period of time. But basically, it's our standard condition. And if we examine 2 different scenarios, one is we say, well, let's assume the same amount of rain, but it occurs over twice as long a period over the year, 14 raining days, but it's a gentler rain. So we get more smaller storms versus the other one will be these 3 raining days, that type 2 rainfall events. That's where everything comes within just a very short period of time. So extremely intense rainfall events. But again, the same amount of water. If we do that, we have our base runoff that you get, and you can compare that just by going with the less intense storms, you get about 60% of that runoff. So there's been a lot more. And then in the model, that's because there's this, it's the evapotranspiration and the loss to the groundwater, or the absorption by the surface, the initial abstraction for those who are familiar with that term. And similarly then, when you have these more intense storms, you get these flashier systems, you get about a 40% increase in the amount of runoff that you would be expecting from the same annual average. But what we've done here is just simulate a difference in the nature of the rainfall events. That really is, I think, kind of the end of my time, and all I wanted to talk about. Again, this is a desktop tool. It's available for the Map Window GIS program, which is a free program. You can get N-SPECT at nspect.codeplex.com. And this year, this is the open source version. We do have a version that runs on Esri's 9.x software. So if you have Esri stuff, and you can go to csc.noaa.gov/nspect to get that. And then I have my contact information and a couple other people who are on the project as well, and you're welcome to contact any of us. And also, as Adam mentioned, we have office hours where from 3 to 4 Eastern Time, we're online every Monday, and give us a shout. And you can find that information also by going to the Digital Coast and looking at the N-SPECT page or CanVis page, and then they'll have our technical support questions there. So I will take any questions folks might have now. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to open up the poll again for Dave's presentation, and Heather is going to again lead the question and answer for Dave's session. So Heather, are you available?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for all the great information. We have a few questions here. The first, I think, that came in early, and I think you may have addressed it, but the question was, does the N-SPECT website contain links to recommended data sources? And also, can you just repeat where users might be able to access soils and precipitation data sources and also land use and land cover data?
Yeah, thanks for that question. There is, if you go to the csd.noaa.gov/NSPECT, go to the support page, then there, under the technical listing on that page, there are some links to how to get how to process the soils data that you would get from the Sergo and getting PRISM data. And so there are links to that, as well as the land cover data. We generally use the CCAP data, which is available on the Digital Coast website as well, and you can browse around through that and download it in the area of interest and the projection that you want. So that information is all there, and we have some guidance documents on how to get it, or how to get it in the format. And there's both a tutorial online and a user's guide on how to use this. And we do, I should have mentioned, we offer training quarterly on N-SPECT. In fact, our next one is coming up next week, so fire us a quick email if you want to get involved in that to any of us up there, and we'll see if we can get you trained up on N-SPECT.
Great. Another question was, what are pollutant coefficients?
So the pollutant coefficients are simply that event mean pollutant concentration. So it's the concentration of a pollutant that's expected in the runoff from a rainfall event. All right, so if you think it's just that. It's the concentration of the pollutant that is going to be in the water. And so that's very similar to, if you're familiar with like the P-load model or that EPA's basin suite of runoff models use. It's a similar approach that's used here.
And that will vary based on the land use or land cover type, right?
Yes, that varies by land use or land cover, and to some extent it may vary with regionally with different practices. For instance, from the agricultural land, how much the different runoff and soil characteristics and fertilizer applications. But so I try to keep people from worrying, from not using the model if they don't think they have exactly the right answer in there, because this model is that's why it's a kind of a course tool to look at what's the relative impact of a change that I'm going to make. And it's doing that comparison between kind of a before and after of either runoff or rainfall events like we saw here or land use change. So even if you're not too comfortable with some of your numbers, if you hold them consistent, you get a pretty good estimate of kind of the direction and the magnitude of the change, and whether or not, it helps you pinpoint where you need to pay attention to and maybe do a more detailed study, or if there's not going to be a big change, maybe you can save some resources and apply them in another area.
Great, and just one more follow-up question on that. So N-SPECT, is it automatically populated with some standardized numbers, in that regard, or do people have to enter?
It is automatically populated with numbers for nitrogen, phosphate, lead, and total suspended solids for using the CCAP land cover data. So yes, there are some in there.
Great.
And it comes with this tutorial data set that is, in fact, the data that I just showed. So people can download it, play with it. That's the other thing. It's pretty easy to use. So it's not a major investment to give it a run. And if you don't like it, you haven't lost too much. But it's easy to figure out whether it's going to be useful for you.
Great. Here's another question. Can it develop images for runoff due to massive forest fire?
Images of runoff due to massive forest fire. So you could, if you mean, could it look at the difference? What it would do is look at the difference in the water volume that ran off, and you could do that by changing the land cover type, and you would probably have to have someone who knows more about the impacts of forest fire than I would. But yeah, you could use it to do that kind of simulation, and you would do that by making another land cover, and that was one of the things I didn't have time to go into. There is something called the land use scenarios. It was a different tab on the bottom where you say, okay, I'm going to have this area within a defined polygon. I'm going to make it have these specific runoff retention coefficients, all of those things that you'd specify. You just do them for kind of a one-off thing. So it's not a typical land cover. It's a specific land use. And a forest fire is a good example of those. You would just need someone who knows, okay, what is that actually going to do to the erodibility of the soils in the area that I'm at, that I'm interested in, and they're going to make it, more permeable or less permeable. But it certainly could do that, assuming that the user provides some of that intellectual background information.
Wonderful. Just a couple more questions. I think we have another minute here. One is, can you say a little bit more about the best or kind of most appropriate geographic scale for using N-SPECT, like watershed, subwatershed, or neighborhood scale? Or is it all of the above?
Yeah, it's based on land cover data, which is usually at the 30-meter data, and so kind of at the subwatershed. The land cover data is the reason we like CCAP data is it's kind of the most accurate land cover data out there, we think, in the sense that we spend a lot of time validating it. But even given that, there's these individual pixels are you can never believe any exact one, and so I think that the accuracy standard for that is kind of 85% overall. So you don't want to get down to the scale where you're only looking at 10 pixels in there. So keeping it up at kind of the watershed and subwatershed and areas. You saw I was looking at neighborhoods and looking at the impacts of that. I think that's appropriate. Again, just be aware of what you're doing and then be honest when you present your results. Always a good plan for any modeler.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dave. I think we had just one or two questions left that maybe we might be able to get to here at the end of the webinar, but I think it's time to move on to the next presenter, so I'm going to turn it back to Jill.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
We're now on to Jeremiah Asher. And Jeremiah, I am going to, as I introduce you, I'm going to make you the presenter. I'm going to unmute you too. But so you can upload the videos that you want. Jeremiah Asher is a GIS specialist with the Institute of Water Research at Michigan State University. He is the chief architect and designer of the Network Neighborhoods for Eco Conservation online application for the Great Lakes Protection Fund, the Water Withdrawal Assessment Tool interface for the state of Michigan's new water legislation, and the Social Indicators Data Management and Analysis Tool for managing social indicators for the improvement of water quality. Jeremiah is going to take us through Michigan State University's NECO program. How are you doing with uploading?
I got the video all set.
Oh, good. All right, well then you should be good to go, and your audio sounds great.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jill. Appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Network Neighborhoods for Eco-Conservation website that we developed. So I'll just kind of give an introductory to the NECO site, talk about some of the uses and value of it, and then go over some of the features and functions, and then open that up for questions at the end. So the Network Neighborhoods website that we developed was basically a application that we made that allows individuals to go in and be able to map green practices such as rain barrels and rain gardens that they've installed at their properties, and to be able to share that information out through social networking tools, and then be able to report on that across the Great Lakes Basin. So how much water is being managed, and what the environmental impacts of those practices have in the Great Lakes area. So the importance for those types of practices, such as the green roofs and rain barrels and rain gardens, is with storm events, they help to slow stormwater runoff and be able to capture that stormwater runoff so that it's less likely to pick up nutrients and sediments as it flows across the landscape and carry those into nearby streams. So this project was kind of unique in that it combined social networking and competitive rivalry to try to increase the adoption of these green practices across the Great Lakes. We had really 4 main goals that we were looking at when we wanted to increase effectiveness for existing environmental groups. So we knew these groups were already doing this type of work as far as adding rain barrels and rain gardens in different communities. And so we really wanted to try to provide some additional tools to help strengthen those efforts that they were doing to help make them a little more effective. And then to try to motivate individuals to adopt these beneficial behaviors across the Great Lakes. And then ultimately manage the stormwater runoff through adoption of green practices, and through doing that improve the health of the Great Lakes by reducing sediment, nutrients, and entering the streams. So in short, basically to see if installing these would help to prevent some of these. So this is kind of the effects of sediment nutrients from unmanaged stormwater and what it can cause, and particularly with climate change, if you have an area that has increased precipitation or increased storm intensity, these types of effects can be even worse. So the value from the Network Neighborhoods website we created was it really provides a suite of practices that anybody can really go ahead and install, homeowners and businesses, that they can use to address stormwater runoff on their property. It also helps out organizations for being able to inventory all the practices that are going on and see what others are doing in communities near them, to be able to share and summarize the benefits that they have, both visually and numerically. And it was nice because a lot of people were doing these types of works but didn't have the ability to show what they were doing. So the site provides a place where they can showcase all their activities. A lot of the watershed groups that we've worked with and partnered with have been really excited that they've been able to go in now to a meeting and easily demonstrate on a map and show all the places that they've installed rain barrels, rain gardens, which has generated a lot of enthusiasm about the work that they're doing. And then it's really kind of provided a first-time opportunity to start at time zero and provide a measure for change. So basically, we didn't really have a way or a system that across the Great Lakes you could look at all the collective effects or impacts from these practices that are being installed. So we can look at the number of practices, how much total water is being managed, and the reductions in sediment and nutrients. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the functions and features of the Network Neighborhoods website. So I'm going to go ahead and play a little video here to kind of walk you through so you can see what this looks like visually. So hopefully this won't end up like a Bruce Lee film where I'm talking and what you're seeing is not matching up, but let's see how it goes here. So this is the front end of the website. We have a couple different sections here. The one that you're seeing now is the top 10 most liked practices, so people can vote on these practices just to kind of have some interactivity in the site. We also have a little section where you can see what people are doing in different neighborhoods as they're interacting on the site, installing rain barrels and rain gardens. So I'm just going to go ahead and log in real quick here. It's a free site, doesn't cost anything to create an account. So I'm going to walk through the process of adding a practice to a map. So I just click this Add Practice to a Map. We have 4 main categories and then kind of an other section for practices that can be installed. In this case, I'll select a rain barrel. All you do is type in an address where that rain barrel has been installed. We also have a batch feature if you have maybe hundreds of practices that you want to load in. Click the Save button, and right now it goes into the map. It adds the feature. It gets the latitude and longitude. It collects precipitation and weather data. It collects soils information. Gets the watershed boundaries. All this stuff is happening in the background as it gets ready to add this into the website. From there, it takes you over into a practices area. So this is a list of all my practices, and this is the one we just added. If you click the edit, it opens up an edit form. I'm going to hop back now to the PowerPoint presentation, and we'll start over here back at the edit screen. So in this edit screen here, for the practice I just added, I can put in name of the project, whatever I want to call it, put in a description or any contact information if I have it. I can put in a project URL or a website to link back to. If I use Snapfish or PhotoBucket or any sort of photo storing website, I can put the URL there. I can provide a video URL to YouTube if I have it. And then we also provide 4 different image uploads that somebody can put in 4 different images and load those into the system. Now, by default, we take a couple assumptions on the average size of roofs and average size of the practice that was selected to give an estimated gallons per year that's being managed by that practice. But then we provide a calculate for me function that if you select that, what it does is it opens up a calculator. So we have 4 different calculators for each of our 4 main practices. We tried to, the calculations we used came up from a literature review that we did, and we tried to reduce the amount of parameters that somebody had to add in so that what we found is if there were too many parameters, people really just didn't enter the data into the system because they just felt overwhelmed. So we tried to limit the amount of inputs and collect as much information as we could in the background. So for this particular one, we have the drainage area, which would be basically the roof size, the width and the length of the rain garden, soil depth information. And then you could select this optional parameters to open up some additional parameters to provide soils information, but we automatically collect that from the Surgo's soils data in the background, so it already takes into account, what the Surgo soil map says that soil type is at that location. And then we also work with our state climatologists to help us put together some estimates over. We looked at 20 years of rainfall data across the Great Lakes, and then broke those into different size rainfall events. So we had an average number of rainfall events over in a given area over a given time. And the importance of that was that, so for many of these, the models that we ran into, like for the simple ones, for say a rain barrel, they looked at the average rainfall, but that really didn't take into account that if you had a half-inch or a 1-inch rainfall event, that rain barrel is going to fill up, at the beginning of that rainfall event, and all that rest of the rain is going to just pour out of the rain barrel, and so it actually won't be captured. So we by breaking those rainfall events into smaller pieces, we were able to estimate a little more accurately how much of the water was actually being stored and how much is going to just overflow and run off. here, we can go ahead and click the View button here, and that'll bring us into the mapping interface. So this just shows us the practice that we added here, and the name of it, and just general description here. You can click the View More to find out more information about that. So any one of these practices you mouse over and click will open up a little diagram if they've loaded up photos in there and the description. The mapping technology we used was Microsoft Bing mapping platform, and this is really kind of a mashup mapping application where we used a variety of different technologies to come up with an end result. And one of the takeaways from this piece here is that we built the mapping interface so that it was very interoperable, meaning we could pass information by using different GIS standards. We could pass mapping information back and forth either from our application or pull in a map from another organization as long as they were following those mapping standards. So again, this is just looking at an aerial photograph. This is just a practice, so you get to see there's a nice high-resolution aerial photography. The reason we chose the Microsoft Bing Maps over, say, Google Maps initially is when we first did this, Microsoft had a lot better aerial photography, particularly in rural areas across the Great Lakes. So I think now they're pretty comparable, but at the time when we were developing, that's what had the biggest lead, so we ran with Microsoft on that. So if we zoom out and look at the Great Lakes, the system automatically keeps track each time that somebody adds a practice in. These are all real practices here that have been added into the system. And every time that somebody adds those in, it color codes the watershed so you get an idea of how many practices are in a given watershed. Up on the legend here, the different dots represent the different practices that are installed. So we have rain barrels, rain gardens, others. We also have we've linked into a live Doppler radar, so we pull that information in here as well. And we have another function in the system that if users are interested, they can get weather alerts that let them know if a storm event's coming, so they can do some different activities to help reduce their amount of runoff that's going into storm drains. And then we have the 8-digit watershed boundaries here, which you're seeing highlighted. We have streams, and then we have smaller 12-digit watersheds as well. This is just a zoom in into the Grand Rapids area, just to show kind of the concentration of practices within neighborhoods. And then another one here, this is in Racine, Wisconsin. This is a watershed group that we've been working with. They've been very active in their particular area. They have a lot of rain gardens and rain barrels installed there. This is a 12-digit watershed boundary, which is smaller than the 8-digit. And what I wanted to show here is that we have some features built in where you can select the layer and click to identify that watershed, and it'll tell you how many practices are installed and how much water is being managed by those practices at that particular watershed. So again, all this stuff is happening in the background. It's all dynamic, so as people add information in, these calculations are continuing to run. And another feature that we have going back to the interoperability of the site is we have a function here that we can add in a layer, a map layer that's from another organization. So for this example, I added in just a home owner-occupied map, and this comes from Esri. And all you do is you put in whatever you want to call it. You provide the URL link that they've provided. Hit OK. And what it does is it dynamically goes out and grabs that map and brings it back in and then adds it here to your data layer. So the importance of that piece is, I did some work with Kill Devil Hills, City of Kill Devil Hills in North Carolina, and they were working with engineers to develop kind of sub-watersheds within the town, and then look at, they basically gave ratings for the drainage systems there on their capacity and what they were able to do and how much they were able to hold. And then if you had that information and you were able to bring that in on a map, you could identify areas in your community where you'd like to add some practices to help manage stormwater runoff, and then use some tools. This is a tool we're getting ready to launch here on the Network Neighborhood site that basically you can select a practice you want, and then use a slider bar to slide over, and it'll tell you how many practices would be required to manage a certain amount of water. And then we'll have some additional what the assumptions are that go into that, and then you can change some of those assumptions and continue to modify that calculator. And it's just a tool, again, to kind of give you an estimate of what you would need to manage a certain amount of water. So I'm going to go briefly and talk a little bit about the reporting piece within network neighborhoods. So there's several ways you can report out information. You can do it on a watershed scale, or you can do it across the Great Lakes Basin. In this example, I'm just going to look at the entire Great Lakes Basin. You can select a start and an end time for your report, and go ahead and hit submit, and then it opens up the report center, gives you some general statistics, in this case about the Great Lakes Basin, but it could be about your watershed. It tells you how much water is being managed, how many practices are installed here, and then what the total amount of nitrogen and phosphorus sediment that's being estimated from the system as far as reductions, and then gives you a breakout of the types of practices that are installed. It also takes that summary information and provides it in graphical form as well, so you can take a look at that. Again, see we have primarily rain barrels currently are the biggest number of practices that are being installed, followed by the rain gardens. And then if we go into the estimated pollutant reductions, this has a graph here of nitrogen, phosphorus, and then estimated reduction of suspended sediment. And the calculations that were used for this came from ALTHEA, which is the long-term hydrologic impact analysis tool that came out of Purdue. And that uses the Natural Resource Conservation Service curve numbers and land use, and then estimated water to look at these reductions in sediment and nutrients. So the reporting so far has been basically on some sort of boundary scale. So we've looked at watershed boundaries or across the Great Lakes Basin, but we also wanted to let people be able to compare things within any given community or within schools or any other sort of district that doesn't necessarily have a specific boundary or can have a boundary. So we created a group section for joining groups and adding all your practice results together. So, and here we provided some default groups that people can join. So we have a list of different states. We also have Michigan State University and Central University, University of Michigan, so you have colleges. And if you want to add your own neighborhood group in, you can go down and just type a group name in and give it a one-sentence description. Click Add, and it'll add your group to this category, and then you can join that group. And then we have a function here where you can invite others to join that group as well. So as others join your group, all their practices and the benefits of those practices all get added to that group's total. And one of the things we were trying to do with the site as well to try to encourage adoption was to maybe try to foster some competitive rivalry to see if that would increase the chance for people to adopt more practices. So in here, when you compare, you can look at your group results, but you can also compare them against other groups. So as you compare against other groups, you can see who has the most number of practices installed, who has the most water that's being managed on a yearly basis. So it's kind of a way we can play with a competitive rivalry, but also see how much information or how much water is being managed at that particular group or location. And then you can do the same thing on an individual basis. You can compare yourself with others to see how you rank as far as the number of practices, the total water managed, how active you are on the website, and then what the environmental impacts are. And then here's another graphical representation of those as well. We have one additional, there's a couple additional features here, but one that's been actually very popular is this photo gallery. So every time that people load photos into the system for a practice that they've added, they go into this photo gallery, and people can go in and vote on these to say, I like this one, or I like this one. And as people vote on those, that goes into that top 10 most liked practices that I mentioned at the very beginning of the page. So it's another way that people can interact on the site. And then any of these you can share, with the common common sharing applications like Facebook and Twitter, or send it by email as well. And the last piece here is just the forum that we've developed, and this has actually turned out to be quite useful for people trying to get information that are learning about green practices that they can install, where they can buy rain barrels, where they can get gardens or plants for rain gardens, and this portion of the site's been pretty good for allowing people to go ahead and participate in that forum and ask those questions and get responses. So with that, I'll bring this to an end, and you can get more information about the Network Neighborhood site. The address here is www.networkedneighbors.org. You can visit the site. We're continuing to add new information up to that site and new tools such as the prediction tool that I mentioned earlier. With that, I'll turn it back to Jill.
Great, thank you, Jeremiah. That was really interesting. I did open up the very last poll with a question from Jeremiah's presentation. I have several questions that I wanted to ask Jeremiah, and then I have a few for Drew as well. First question I have for you, Jeremiah, is how did you spread the word about this tool to encourage more private citizens to use it, and how do people tend to initially become aware of it?
Primarily what we did with this particular project is we had 4 different groups that we worked with. One in Racine, Wisconsin, one in Grand Rapids, Michigan, another in Toledo, Ohio, and then we had an individual that was working out in Holland, Michigan. And so these were watershed groups, and they had members that they worked with. So part of our strategy was to have those groups use the tool and pass that information out to the members that they regularly work with. And then another thing we did is we did a lot of presentations, working around with different communities. We did some cold calling with watershed organizations, talked with them as well, to try to get the word out. And then we tried to use the social networking tools on the system, which have been slow to start to work, but we are seeing that they are working. So in the mapping interface, you'll see that there's clusters of information where people have added practices that weren't there before, and those kind of clusters will start in one particular area, and then they'll start to spread out a little bit. And we know just from having some conversations that those have come from people sharing information either with their friends, passing it along, or picking it up from a meeting, and then mapping a practice, and then others seeing that practice and kind of doing the same thing.
Okay, thanks, Jeremiah. There was a follow-up to that. Some people were asking, have the majority of the users so far been a result of partnerships with local organizations?
The majority, yes, I would say the majority have been. We have had a few people in different communities that have found it through Google. We had one group in near Detroit that had found it on Google and started to try to use it in their neighborhood. And so but I would say the majority of people have been through our partners at this point in the development.
Okay. The other question I had was, we had quite a few people asking if this tool could be applicable to other regions outside of the Great Lakes. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about that. People were asking also if there's an equivalent Canadian tool as well.
There's not an equivalent Canadian tool that we have, although the platform we developed was very scalable. So if you go and put in a practice in California, it will work and it will run. The only difference is that for the calculators, we have information that on weather and precipitation events that were calculated for the Great Lakes Basin. So we don't have that information outside. So some of those calculations might be off, or we'd have to use averages for those. And I think we might have a few averages in there. But our plan is to continue to populate those for the other other parts of the states as well.
Okay, one last question for you, and then I have one more question for Drew. Does the site contain information on the models used to predict impacts and reports? And if not, is this information available?
It currently does not, but in that tool that we are adding, we list all of the models and the calculations that we use, and what all those assumptions are. So each one of those will be just kind of laid right out with each of the formulas that went behind those, and where we pulled the information from, and where the sources were. So they're not up there now, but they will be.
Okay. I'm going to unmute Drew for a second if he is still here. Unfortunately, Adam and Dave both had to go off to another presentation. However, I do have a couple answers from them that I will post later on in our archive that answers several questions that people had as dealing with N-SPECT. Drew, are you there?
Yep.
Oh, great. We had a question to see if you could elaborate more on the misuse of temperature and water balance in the water balance model that you mentioned. Would this be worsened for a smaller lake like Lake Champlain?
That's a good question.
You need the...
I don't know the relationship between... So the question has to do, I think, with my comment that in a lot of rainfall runoff models, one of the things we have to do is estimate the loss of water off the landscape due to evapotranspiration, and that in conventional models, because it's hard to get evaporation and evapotranspiration data directly, we use temperature as a proxy for that loss. Now, how that assumption leads to errors in runoff over different scales is a great question, and I don't know the answer to that question. I suspect it would be related to a lot of other factors, not just the size of the lake and not just the size of the basin.
Okay. I think actually that's all the questions that we have right now. We will follow up with Dave and Adam with any questions that you may have, so please feel free to send to me if you have some follow-up questions. I wanted to, again, thank all of the presenters for their willingness to talk with us today about climate change impacts that we could face and the planning tools that we can use to help prepare. A really excellent discussion. I also want to thank the Great Lakes Regional Water Program and NOAA for funding this webinar. I did want to let you know that our survey URL for this webinar is in the chat feature, so if you could please take a few minutes to fill that out. We would like to get your input as we develop a regional climate site, so please take some time, if you could, to fill that out and to find out whether or not you like these kind of climate tools webinar series. This presentation, this webinar was sponsored by the Great Lakes Regional Water Program and was hosted by Ohio State University's Ohio Sea Grant, Michigan State University, Old Woman Creek, and ODNR Division of Wildlife. We want to again thank Drew, Adam, Dave, and Jeremiah and all the participants for this on this webinar. We hope this was beneficial and hope you'll join us again in an upcoming webinar. Thank you and have a great afternoon.